12 of the world's most expensive medical specialists stood around the dying king of the New York underworld, completely baffled. His organs were shutting down, and his empire was on the brink of a bloody civil war. They missed the obvious, but the girl scrubbing the floor didn't. The Romano estate in Long Island was entirely locked down. Outside the towering wrought-iron gates, 12 black SUVs sat idling their heavily armed drivers, chain-smoking in the freezing November air. Inside the sprawling 30-room mansion, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The undisputed head of the Romano syndicate, Maximilian Romano, was dying, and no one knew why. At 34, Maximilian was supposed to be in his prime. He was a ruthless but highly principled man who had dragged his family's operations out of the gutter of street-level extortion and into the untouchable realms of corporate real estate and international shipping. But now the man who commanded thousands of loyal soldiers was confined to a custom-built, sterile medical suite in his own master bedroom, his skin the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and violently erratic. 12 of the world's most elite physicians surrounded his bed. They were a mix of top-tier private practitioners and black market specialists flown in from Geneva, London, and Los Angeles paid millions to keep their mouths shut and save their employer. His troponin levels are off the charts, and he's experiencing severe bradycardia, argued Dr. Harrison Weber, a renowned cardiologist who had once operated on heads of state. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, staring at the glowing monitors. It presents like viral myocarditis, but the onset is too rapid. We need to prep him for a transplant. A transplant won't save him if it's systemic, countered Dr. Mercer, a toxicologist. I've run panels for ricin arsenic, thallium polonium, and every heavy metal known to man. They are all negative. The liver enzymes suggest acute failure, but there is no structural damage to the bile ducts. It's an autoimmune cascade. His own body is tearing itself apart. As the doctors bickered in their high-level medical jargon, a young woman in a drab grey uniform quietly pushed a mop bucket into the periphery of the room. Celine Jenkins, 24, kept her eyes firmly glued to the hardwood floor. She worked for a discreet high-end cleaning service that catered to the ultra-wealthy, and she knew the golden rule of her job be invisible. She was drowning in over $200,000 of medical debt for her younger brother's leukemia treatments, and the hazard pay she received for cleaning a Mafia boss's private estate was the only thing keeping her family from living on the streets. Celine moved methodically, wiping down the baseboards, while the titans of medicine argued over Maximilian's failing heart. She was a ghost in the room. But unlike the doctors whose eyes were locked on iPads, blood test results, and heart monitors, Celine was looking at the room itself. She noticed the heavily armed guards standing by the door, specifically Arthur Pendleton, Maximilian's trusted consigliere. Arthur stood with his hands neatly folded behind his back, his face a mask of solemn grief. Yet every so often Arthur's eyes would dart toward a sleek, modern ultrasonic humidifier humming quietly on the nightstand beside Maximilian's bed. The doctors had ignored it. It was just a humidifier placed there to ease the dry, rattling cough that plagued Maximilian's lungs. But Celine couldn't ignore it. As she wrung out her mop near the bed, she caught a whiff of the mist. It wasn't the standard eucalyptus or sterile saline smell. It was faint, sweet, and sharply earthy, like the smell of crushed almonds, mixed with something dark and rooty. Celine paused, her heart skipping a beat. Before her father had passed away and left her family in financial ruin, he had owned a sprawling botanical nursery. Celine had spent her entire childhood studying plant biology, intending to become a botanist, before life derailed her dreams. She knew scents. She knew roots. She knew toxins. She looked closer at the humidifier. The water inside wasn't perfectly clear. It had a very faint, almost imperceptible blue-grey tint. "His blood pressure is crashing again," Dr. Webber shouted, rushing to the bedside as the monitors began to scream. "Push another milligram of epinephrine, we're losing him." Maximilian began to seize his powerfully built frame, thrashing against the high thread count sheets. The room erupted into chaos. Nurses' scrambled vials crashed to the floor, and the doctors began frantically barking contradictory orders. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, his voice perfectly modulated with faux panic. "Do something, you're supposed to be the best in the world." Celine stood frozen. She looked at Maximilian's pale, sweat-drenched face. She looked at the blue-tinted vapor blowing directly over his face, filling his gasping lungs with every desperate breath. Then she looked at the symptoms flashing on the monitors: severe arrhythmias, vomiting, extreme weakness, and dilated pupils. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't an autoimmune disease. And it wasn't a standard heavy metal poison. It was aconite, wolf's bane, specifically an extracted vaporized form of it being pumped directly into his respiratory system, bypassing his stomach entirely, which was why the toxicologist's blood and gastric tests weren't catching it in the standard panels. Celine looked at Arthur. He was staring at the humidifier, waiting for Maximilian to take his final breath. "Clear!" Dr. Webber yelled, holding the defibrillator paddles. "Wait!" The scream tore through the room, silencing the frantic beeping of the machines for a fraction of a second. Everyone froze. 12 elite doctors, 3 hardened Mafia enforcers, and 1 traitor all turned to look at the girl in the grey uniform, clutching a wet mop. Celine's whole body was trembling. She had just broken the cardinal rule of her employment and possibly signed her own death warrant. "What the hell is this?" Arthur snarled, his polite veneer instantly dropping. He gestured to one of the hulking guards at the door, a man named Rocco. "Get the maid out of here, now." "No, listen to me," Celine shouted, dropping the mop and pointing a shaking finger at the nightstand. "Turn off the humidifier. You're killing him." Dr. Mercer scoffed, deeply offended. "Security, remove her. We are in the middle of a resuscitation." Rocco stepped forward, his massive hand wrapping around Celine's bicep with bruising force. "Come on, sweetheart. Time to go." "He's being poisoned." Celine fought against Rocco's grip, her feet sliding on the polished floor. Desperation made her reckless. She realized that if Maximilian died, she would be out of a job, her brother would lose his treatments, and she would have to live, knowing she let a man be murdered in front of her. It's aconitum napellus wolfsbane. "Look at the vapor." Arthur's face went ghost white for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of absolute panic that Celine caught instantly. "She's a lunatic. Break her jaw and throw her outside," Arthur ordered coldly. But the specific Latin name made Dr. Mercer pause. He looked from Celine to the humidifier. The toxicologist's brain finally connected the dots, the erratic heart rhythms, the tingling extremities Maximilian had complained about days ago, the negative blood tests for standard ingested poisons. "Wait," Dr. Mercer commanded. He pushed past the nurses and slammed his hand onto the power button of the humidifier. The sweet, earthy mist stopped flowing. He unscrewed the water tank, holding it up to the harsh overhead medical lights. The faint blue-grey tint was undeniable. He brought it cautiously to his nose and sniffed. "Dear God," Dr. Mercer whispered. He looked at Dr. Webber. "Aconitine alkaloid. Inhaled. It bypassed hepatic first-pass metabolism, hitting his heart and nervous system directly. That's why the standard panels missed it. Give him amiodarone for the arrhythmia now, and get him on pure oxygen to flush his lungs." Dr. Mercer barked completely, abandoning his previous protocol. The medical team pivoted instantly, operating with the terrifying efficiency of people who realized they had almost let a man be assassinated under their noses. Arthur took a slow step backward, toward the heavy oak doors, his hand slipping inside his tailored suit jacket to grasp the handle of his suppressed pistol. But Rocco, whose loyalty belonged entirely to Maximilian, saw the movement. Rocco let go of Celine and drew his weapon in a blur, aiming it directly at Arthur's chest. "Hands where I can see 'em, Artie." Rocco growled, his eyes narrowing. Over the next 20 minutes, Celine stood pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she watched a miracle unfold. With the continuous flow of the airborne toxin cut off and the proper antiarrhythmic drugs flooding his system, Maximilian Romano's heart rate began to stabilize. The deadly spikes on the monitor smoothed out into a steady, albeit weak, rhythm. Color began to slowly creep back into his lips. Dr. Weber exhaled a long, shaky breath, wiping sweat from his forehead. He turned to look at Celine, his expression a mix of profound, professional embarrassment and deep awe. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. My dad owned a botanical garden," Celine stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I recognized the smell. And I saw him." She pointed a shaky finger at Arthur, who was now disarmed and forced to his knees by Rocco and 2 other guards. He kept staring at the machine. He knew. A low, raspy groan echoed from the bed. Everyone turned. Maximilian's heavy eyelids fluttered open. His dark, piercing eyes were bloodshot and exhausted, but the violent delirium that had plagued him for days was gone. He looked around the room, taking in the scene, his doctors looking terrified, his closest advisor kneeling at gunpoint, and a tiny, terrified maid pressed against his bedroom wall. Despite being minutes away from death, the aura of power radiating from the man was suffocating. Maximilian slowly pushed the oxygen mask down from his face. "Rocco." Maximilian's voice was a gravelly whisper, barely audible over the hum of the machines. "Yeah, boss," Rocco asked, keeping his gun locked on Arthur. "Take Arthur to the basement. Make sure he stays awake." Maximilian's gaze shifted from the traitor to the doctors. "And get these highly paid idiots out of my sight." The medical team didn't dare argue. They packed their equipment with silent, terrified speed and practically ran out of the room. Finally, Maximilian's intense dark eyes locked onto Celine. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. He wasn't looking at her the way the doctors had, like she was a piece of furniture. He was looking at her like she was the only real thing in the room. "You," he rasped, lifting a heavy hand and gesturing toward her. "Come here." Celine hesitated. Every instinct told her to run to grab her mop bucket and flee the estate before she got dragged into the violent, terrifying world of the Romano Syndicate. But she knew you didn't say no to Maximilian Romano. She took slow, trembling steps until she stood beside his bed. Up close, despite the illness, he was strikingly handsome with sharp jawlines and eyes that held far too many dark secrets. "What's your name?" he asked. "Celine Jenkins," she whispered. Maximilian reached out, his fingers still cold from the brush with death wrapped gently but firmly around her wrist. "You just saved my life, Celine Jenkins. 12 doctors couldn't do it, but you did." I just noticed the smell, sir. I should get back to cleaning." "You're not cleaning anymore," Maximilian interrupted, his grip tightening just a fraction, anchoring her to his side. His eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You're staying right here. From this second forward, you're the only person I trust." Within 24 hours, Celine Jenkins's life was entirely unrecognizable. She had arrived at the Romano estate in a faded gray uniform carrying the weight of a $200,000 medical debt. She woke up the next morning in a guest suite that rivaled the penthouses at the Ritz-Carlton, wrapped in silk sheets, her uniform replaced by a wardrobe of designer clothes that fit her perfectly. But the most shocking change came via a brief clinical phone call from the billing department at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Her brother's leukemia treatments, his outstanding room fees, and his upcoming bone marrow transplant had all been paid in full. An anonymous wire transfer had cleared the entire balance, leaving a surplus for future care. Celine dropped her phone on the plush Persian rug, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She knew exactly who the anonymous benefactor was. "I prefer my debts settled immediately." A deep, gravelly voice echoed from the doorway. Celine whipped around. Maximilian Romano leaned heavily against the oak door frame, clutching a silver-tipped cane. He looked paler than a ghost, his dark eyes bruised with exhaustion, but the raw magnetic authority he projected was undiminished. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that hung slightly loose on his diminished frame. "You didn't have to do that," Celine whispered, wiping her face. "I was just doing my job. Well, not my actual job, but I couldn't let you die. Arthur Pendleton was my closest friend for 15 years, Maximilian said, slowly stepping into the room. Every movement seemed to cost him immense physical effort, but his gaze never left hers. He sat at my dining table. He knew my vulnerabilities. And yet, he bought a hybridized strain of aconitum from a black market broker in Eastern Europe and pumped it into my lungs. You, a stranger earning minimum wage to scrub my floors, saved my life. So yes, Celine, I did have to do that, and you are no longer a maid." "Then what am I?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of his intense stare. "For now, my shadow," Maximilian replied, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Arthur didn't act alone. He was a strategist, not a chemist. Someone supplied him with that poison. Someone inside my inner circle wants me dead. And until I find out who it is, the only person in this entire God-forsaken syndicate I can trust is the girl who knows what wolfsbane smells like." For the next 2 weeks, Celine became a prisoner in a golden cage. Wherever Maximilian went within the sprawling, heavily fortified Long Island estate, Celine followed. She sat quietly in the corner of his mahogany-paneled office while he conducted ruthless business meetings, her eyes trained on the men who came and went. She watched Maximilian rebuild his strength, marveling at his sheer willpower. He was a terrifying man, cold, calculating, and capable of breathtaking violence. Yet in the quiet, agonizingly late hours of the night, when the pain in his chest from the tissue damage became too much, he allowed Celine to see a different side of him. He let her mix his herbal teas, trusting her botanical knowledge over his personal chefs. He listened to her talk about her father's nursery, about the intricacies of soil, pH, and rare orchids, his dark eyes softening as he watched her speak. A dangerous, unspoken tension began to simmer between them. It was a volatile mix of absolute dependency and undeniable attraction. Celine found herself staring at the sharp line of his jaw when he wasn't looking, and Maximilian would frequently dismiss his hulking guards just to be alone in a room with her. But the fragile peace was shattered on a rainy Tuesday morning. Rocco Maximilian's loyal enforcer burst into the study without knocking. His face was a grim mask of fury. "Boss, we have a problem." Maximilian didn't flinch. He slowly set down his espresso cup. "Speak." "Arthur is dead," Rocco growled, his hands balled into massive fists. "I went down to the basement holding cell to interrogate him again. Found him on the floor, dead for at least 4 hours. Maximilian's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He was under 24-hour watch. How? "That's the thing," Rocco said, glancing uneasily at Celine. The guards didn't see anyone go in or out, but his breakfast tray. The coffee was spilled. We ran a quick tox screen on the liquid. Celine's blood ran cold. Aconite. She guessed her voice, barely a whisper. Rocco nodded slowly. Ingested this time. High dose. Heart stopped in minutes. Maximilian stood up, knocking his leather chair backward. The fury radiating from him was palpable. Someone in my house bypassed my security, poisoned my prisoner, and silenced my only lead. The rot is deeper than Arthur. Celine stood by the bookshelves, her mind racing. The estate was locked down. No one from the outside could get in. The food was prepped in a highly monitored kitchen. How did they get the poison into Arthur's coffee? She closed her eyes, thinking back to her father's greenhouse. Aconite was incredibly unstable in liquid form if exposed to heat. Putting it in hot coffee would denature the alkaloid, rendering it mostly harmless. The killer wouldn't have risked the poison breaking down in the heat. Rocco, Celine interrupted, stepping forward. Both men turned to look at her. Was there sugar on the tray? Sugar cubes? Rocco frowned. Yeah, Arthur always took his coffee sweet. There were a couple of half-melted cubes on the saucer. It wasn't in the coffee, Celine said, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was laced into the sugar cubes. Aconitine extract can be crystallized. You drop the cube into the warm liquid it dissolves, and you drink it before the heat destroys the toxin. It's brilliant, and it requires someone who knows exactly how to handle raw botanical extracts. Maximilian walked slowly toward her, stopping mere inches away. The scent of his expensive bergamot cologne mixed with the sharp smell of rain from the open window. Who has access to the pantry, Rocco? The chefs, the kitchen staff, and... Rocco trailed off his face, draining of color. And your cousin, Keo. He owns the import-export company that supplies all the dry goods and specialty ingredients for the estate. Maximilian's expression went completely blank, a terrifying void that promised absolute destruction. Keo Romano was the charismatic, impeccably dressed golden boy of the syndicate. He managed the legitimate fronts, the shipping containers, the fine dining restaurants, the luxury imports. He had been at Maximilian's bedside every single day during his illness, crying tears that Celine now realized were a masterclass in deception. We take him now, Rocco said, pulling his weapon from its shoulder holster. No, Maximilian said softly, his voice dangerously calm. If we grab Keo without definitive proof, the commission will split. Half the capos will back him, claiming I've gone paranoid from the sickness. We need him to confess. We need to catch him in the act. How? Rocco demanded. He already knows Arthur is dead. He's going to go to ground. He doesn't know we know, Maximilian corrected. He turned to Celine, his eyes dark and calculating. Keo is hosting the annual family syndicate dinner tomorrow night at the estate. He'll be pouring the wine. He'll be making toasts to my miraculous recovery. You think he'll try again? Celine asked her, throat tight. I am the only thing standing between Keo and total control of the eastern seaboard, Maximilian said, reaching out to gently trace the line of Celine's cheekbone with his thumb. His touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. He's desperate. Arthur's failure made him sloppy. He will try to finish the job tomorrow, and he will use the one method he trusts. The following evening, the grand dining hall of the Romano estate was transformed into a scene of opulent power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a massive mahogany table set for 20 of the most dangerous men in North America. Celine stood in the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes, wearing a sleek black evening gown Maximilian had ordered for her. She was supposed to be blending in with the background staff, but her eyes were locked entirely on Keo Romano. Keo was working the room with a $1 million smile, clapping capos on the back and kissing the cheeks of their wives. He looked perfectly at ease, but Celine noticed the slight nervous tick in his jaw. Maximilian sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the resurrected king. He laughed at the right moments, drank sparingly, and commanded the room with an effortless, terrifying grace. As the main course was cleared, Kyo stood up, raising a crystal glass of deep red Barolo wine. The room immediately fell silent. Family. Kyo projected his voice, ringing off the high ceilings. The last few weeks have tested us. We almost lost our leader, my blood, my brother. But Maximilian Romano is made of iron. Kyo smiled warmly down the table at Maximilian. To Maximilian, may your reign be long and your health be unbreakable. To Maximilian, the men echoed, raising their glasses. Celine's eyes darted to the ornate, heavy silver wine decanter, resting on the sideboard near Kyo's chair. Earlier that afternoon, she had watched Kyo personally pour the vintage Barolo into that specific decanter. But what caught her eye wasn't the wine itself. It was the small, velvet-lined box resting half-open inside Kyo's suit pocket when he turned to sit down. It was a custom carrying case for a cigar cutter, but a tiny trace of fine, crystalline white powder dusted the dark velvet. Celine didn't think. She reacted. As Maximilian raised his glass to his lips, Celine broke from the shadows. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, shattering the dignified silence of the toast. "Don't drink that!" Celine shouted, her voice echoing violently in the cavernous room. Every gun in the room was half drawn before anyone even registered what was happening. 20 hardened Mafia bosses stared at the girl in the black dress who had just sprinted toward the head of the table. Kyo's face contorted in sudden naked panic. "Guards, get this crazy bitch out of here!" he roared, reaching inside his jacket. But Maximilian didn't even flinch. He simply lowered his glass and stared at his cousin. "Let her speak, Kyo. She has a habit of saving my life." Celine reached Maximilian's side, breathing heavily. She pointed directly at Kyo's chest. "Check his inside left pocket. He has a cigar case. The aconitine crystals are in it. He slipped them into your glass when he poured the toast." The silence that followed was deafening. Kyo laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Maximilian, this is insane. This girl is your maid. She's delusional." Maximilian looked at Rocco, who was already moving. Rocco crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Kyo by the lapels and practically lifting him off the floor. Rocco jammed a hand into Kyo's pocket and pulled out the velvet-lined cigar case. He snapped it open. Inside, sitting in a small glass vial, was a 1/4 ounce of perfectly crystallized aconitine extract, the color completely drained from Kyo's face. The capos around the table slowly stood up, their expressions shifting from confusion to cold, murderous rage. To attempt an assassination was one thing. To do it at a family dinner, risking collateral damage, was an unforgivable violation of the syndicate's oldest laws. "You were always impatient, Kyo," Maximilian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. He stood up slowly, picking up his tainted wine glass. He walked down the length of the table until he stood face to face with his trembling cousin. "Arthur was a pawn. You were the kingmaker. You imported the flowers through your shell companies, extracted the toxin, and tried to choke me in my sleep." "Dom, please!" Kyo begged, tears streaming down his face as Rocco held him in a vice grip. "I can explain. The commission. They thought you were getting too soft, shifting us too far into legal real estate. It was just business. This," Maximilian whispered, holding up the wine glass, "is personal." Maximilian didn't yell. He didn't order an execution. He simply looked at Rocco and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Rocco dragged a screaming Kyo out of the dining room. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, echoing with finality. Maximilian turned back to the table of stunned, silent capos. The dinner is over. My cousin has unexpectedly decided to retire. I suggest you all go home and reflect on the absolute premium I place on loyalty." Within 5 minutes, the dining hall was entirely empty, save for Maximilian and Celine. The adrenaline suddenly drained from Celine's body, leaving her shaking so violently she had to grip the back of a mahogany chair to stay upright. She had just publicly condemned a high-ranking Mafia boss to death. There was no going back. She was entirely submerged in this dark, bloody world. Maximilian walked slowly back to her. The cold, ruthless monster that had just banished his own flesh and blood to a shallow grave vanished, replaced by a man looking at a woman with absolute, unguarded reverence. He stopped in front of her, gently prying her white-knuckled fingers off the chair. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her waist. He was warm, solid, and overwhelmingly safe. "You broke cover," Maximilian murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. "You risked your life in front of the most dangerous men in this city to stop me from taking a sip of wine." "I couldn't lose you," Celine whispered into his suit jacket, the truth finally breaking through her fear. "I couldn't let them win." Maximilian tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his dark, burning gaze. "They will never win, because they don't have you. You are my compass, Celine, my protector. And God help anyone who ever tries to take you from me." He kissed her then, and it wasn't the tentative, careful kiss of a patient recovering from an illness. It was fierce, possessing, and absolute. It was a vow sealed in the aftermath of betrayal, a promise that the king of the underworld had finally found his queen. The empire had been poisoned from the inside out, but as Maximilian held Celine tight against him in the silent dining hall, he knew his reign was finally truly secure. Enjoyed this thrilling Mafia romance. The world of Maximilian and Celine is just getting started. If you want to see more dramatic stories of betrayal, loyalty, and undeniable passion, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Celine's shoes? Let us know.